Hello, I'm Hamish Morrison. I'm a political reporter with The National, and I'm joined today by Ethan Stone of OpenDemocracy. Ethan is the man who revealed that Labour took £4 million donation from a Cayman Islands tax haven. So, Ethan, take it away. Tell us a little bit about how this story came about. You've been following this for a while.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Nice to be here. I particularly got interested in what I perceive to be a kind of a shift, quite a significant shift, I suppose, in the support base that was backing Labour. Probably from kind of the start of 2022 onwards, I think there was a feeling that kind of started to grow stronger from around that time that it seemed increasingly likely that a Labour Party, more than likely led by Keir Starmer, would form the next government. And I think as time progressed, it became clearer that government would likely be it would likely have a pretty large majority and may well kind of be well situated to govern for more than one term. So I think at that point we were starting to ask the question of, in whose interests will they govern, and who are the kind of material backers of this project, which in political terms, is emerged quite rapidly. Starmer is not someone who had a long kind of career in politics and in the Labour Party and built up a power base within the party prior to coming into the leadership. So this project around him has been built up quite quickly. And I think what we see is that it's been heavily influenced by people who are quite long-term factional fighters in the party, and that have leaned on financial backers who have traditionally supported the party's kind of centre-right and right-wing. So to kind of to move forward a little bit in time to the donation that I guess we're here to talk primarily about. Quadrature is a quite a large hedge fund which controls, or which has holdings according to its last filings with the US SEC of about $6 billion. It's a large hedge fund. Its average salary for staff is about £3 million a year, wow. which is quite a lot even for the industry. There's some quite funny reporting from the kind of financial press about Quadrature, although they do maintain quite a low profile, where people who work in that industry and are used to some kind of pretty large salaries are quite taken aback by that figure. So I first became aware of Quadrature probably about 9 months ago when an individual donated to Labour, whose name I hadn't kind of seen come up before, and I kind of had a look into his background, and he was a senior advisor at Quadrature, and as an individual, he's given more than £500,000 to the party in a year, which that would be, that puts him in, the top probably 20 individual donors to the party in recent years. So quite significant. Yeah. But then Quadrature have obviously kind of completely blown that out of the water as an organisation by giving this £4 million, which is the largest political donation to a party that Labour has ever received, and it is one of the largest donations kind of ever in British political history. The timing of it, I think we can probably kind of talk about that, because I think that's it's almost as important.
Sweet spot, didn't it, where it was they didn't need to declare it until after the election had actually been fought.
Yeah, so I haven't really been able to kind of come up with a better term than like a kind of window of intransparency, which is quite naff, really. But that's essentially what we're talking about. Like, as you'll know, it may be worth kind of just spelling out. Like, when political parties get donations over a certain size, I think the limit currently is £11,000. They have to list those and declare them to the Electoral Commission, which then publishes that data with a kind of a quarter delay. So donations received in Q1 will be published in the kind of towards the end of the following quarter. And that's how it works outside of an election period, which I think, makes sense. I don't think there's a great argument for more rapid transparency outside of an election. But, when there's an election on, voters, quite understandably, I think, want to know who's pumping money into the party that they might be considering voting for, right? Because it tells us something about what that party represents and in whose interest it's acting. So the donation is called, the election rather is called, and then within 3 days, Labour has accepted this donation for £4 million. Now, you and I will know that a donation of that size in particular, it doesn't just drop into it doesn't just drop into the Labour Party's bank account and that's the first thing they hear of it. There will have been discussions, there will have been, you would hope, there will have been checks carried out on the source of it, and things like that for legal reasons. So we know that any claim that this came about by coincidence during a period in which it doesn't have to be declared it doesn't kind of stand up to any scrutiny. Because there was basically a week-long window between the election being called and all donations that come in during the election being published prior to polling day. And this happened to fall, during that period, which I don't know about you, that strikes me as yeah. I think when we think about the practicalities involved, that's one aspect of it. It would be very easy, given that we know that there was an existing relationship between Labour and a senior person at this firm. I think, and probably it may sound bad that we're kind of speculating a little bit here, but I think it's worth pointing out that Labour have categorically refused to, at least to me, and to other people that I know who've asked them about this, have refused to talk about it and just refused to answer questions about it. I think both of us would rather be sat here in a position where we'd had some answers from Labour about whether they are claiming this is a coincidence or not, but they won't talk about it, which people will kind of draw their own conclusions about that, I suppose.
I think it's been the bog standard line of basically just that it's been declared within the rules, right? That's pretty much what I've seen them say publicly about it, which is obviously, which, is true, it has been declared within the rules. It's that they set the rules because they set the rules of the Electoral Commission, and they could change the rules if they wanted to, and they could tell us, what conversations happened before this donation, and what kind of strings may have been attached to it.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think the other aspect of this is that it fits a pattern of behaviour that under or that can be kind of associated with the Starmer project, right? So you go back to Keir Starmer's leadership election, his campaign to take over the leadership of the Labour Party, and unlike the other candidates at the time, Starmer, again within the rules, but I think against the spirit of transparency in which the rules are written, Starmer failed to declare his big financial backers in that election campaign until after votes had been cast. Now, when we look at who some of those early backers of his campaign were, I think that most Labour members, had they seen who was putting up the money to support him, they may have had some questions about this image that Starmer was trying to portray at that time of his campaign being about essentially, kind of continuity Corbynism, but in a sharp suit. Now, you can have your criticisms of that or not, but I think there is a fundamental dishonesty about presenting yourself in that way, and concealing for a crucial amount of time that your backers are people who have long been associated with, I guess, the antithesis of that kind of politics within the Labour Party. So that's one aspect of it. Later on, you have Labour Together, this think tank / kind of super PAC that pulled in vast amounts of money and failed to declare it for a long time. This actually wasn't within the rules. They ended up being fined by the Electoral Commission because over a period of a couple of years, they failed to declare around £700,000 worth of donations, again from figures who are associated with the right of the Labour Party. The common thread, of course, between those two things, Starmer's leadership campaign and Labour Together, is Morgan McSweeney, who is now Number 10's Director of Political Strategy, has been a key figure basically since Starmer emerged as a potential replacement for Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader, and now sits at the heart of his Downing Street operation. He ran Starmer's campaign, and he was Director of Labour Together at the time. So I think viewed in that context, it becomes even more difficult to believe that the timing of this donation was anything but intentional. And I mean, we can probably talk a little bit about, why they might have wanted to conceal that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the question then becomes, because Labour did make a big thing during the campaign of saying, of briefing the newspapers and saying, oh, we're on a charm offensive with the city, for instance. We've got all of these. So they weren't exactly ashamed to have friends in high places with very deep pockets. So why would you think they wanted to keep this particular one under wraps until after the election?
I think that's one of the most interesting things about it, is that there is clearly, even in this context that you've set out, that Labour is, if anything, I think you speak to some people in the kind of business community, and I think some of them believe that they are kind of overstating and kind of pushing that narrative even further than has justification, that they are fully backed by business and stuff. But I think that then we come back to the specifics of this donation, and A, its size, B, hedge funds are already a fairly kind of, even within the financial sector, are one of the more controversial kind of types of financial entity. The nature of the work they do, which is kind of
just maybe explain what a hedge fund actually does as well, because I think maybe not everyone would be.
And I think there's some kind of intentional, as we saw from the case with these kind of companies, it's made to sound much more complicated than it is oftentimes. Essentially, they're kind of placing bets through the instrument of often buying securities or shares in publicly listed companies. They're essentially kind of placing a bet on whether the value of these shares will go up or down by having a position which is either kind of going long on it, in which case they are hoping that the value goes up, or going short on it, which is essentially betting that the value of this, usually a publicly traded company, will go down. There are probably people who know much more about the kind of financial industry than me, who are kind of tearing their hair out slightly. That's probably a slight oversimplification.
You're hedging your bets, basically. That's where the money comes from.
Very good. That's what it is. And so, but because of the nature of that, and it's gamifying the economy and betting on companies, and it distorts the real world economic impact of lots of industries. And I think that's why people have an issue with hedge funds and the broader financialization of so much of our economy, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it, and I also think it's about saying it's just one potential angle of attack that they wanted to kind of shut out if they could control it. I think there was probably an assumption that it will generate some negative headlines, and we would rather avoid it if we can.
Not least of all based in a tax haven.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the other side of it. This is the next kind of aspect of it, which again, it can risk getting a bit complicated, because what is actually going on here, right, is that you have the Quadrature Group, which is a group of entities, one of which is Quadrature Capital Limited, which is technically registered in the UK. And that firm is technically an investment advisor to Quadrature Group. Again, it's all quite complicated, but the main UK-based entity is Quadrature Limited. But as of April last year, that was acquired wholly, 100%, by a company registered in the Cayman Islands called QC Ventures, QC being Quadrature Capital. Now, the good thing about the Cayman Islands, if you are not particularly keen on corporate transparency, is that it's much harder to get hold of the details of who actually owns a company, and unlike UK registered companies that file accounts at Companies House, and as journalists or as members of the public, we can go and have a bit of a look and a bit of a snoop around and kind of get a little bit of a sense of who might own it and how much money they're making and that kind of thing. If you are a company registered in the Cayman Islands or a number of other kind of offshore jurisdictions that are favoured for kind of tax and transparency purposes, the information about you in the public domain is much more limited. So we can say with certainty that QC Ventures, when it was formed in 2018, the directors were the two founder directors of Quadrature Capital and another senior director at the firm, as well as an individual who is essentially what's called like a kind of a corporate services provider. So works at a law firm in the Cayman Islands or a similar company, and basically what they sell is off-the-shelf companies that are formed in the Cayman Islands for various purposes. But that company acquired Quadrature Capital as part of what the firm describes as a restructure. Now, we should state here that Quadrature say that none of this was for tax purposes, and that they in fact have an arrangement with HMRC that even though they are based in the Cayman Islands as a hedge fund for various reasons by their kind of telling of it, that they have an arrangement with HMRC where they do pay tax, they pay corporation tax in the UK in the normal way. A few things I guess to say about that, and with the caveat that I am certainly not a professional tax lawyer or accountant. I would be on much better money if I was. But I think like for a start, if you have a voluntary arrangement with HMRC to pay tax, you're doing one better than the rest of us who have a very much non-voluntary arrangement with HMRC to pay tax, and so they're already better situated than the average company from that point of view. And also the thing is, and this is not to say that they aren't telling the full truth about that, but ultimately like we are kind of reliant on their word at this point. When they say we do pay tax in the UK through our main fund, the UK organisation paid corporation tax last year before this restructure was completely carried out. We will see in October when the next set of accounts are filed what the UK-based operation has paid in tax in the last financial year. But it certainly speaks to, and I think you're right, I think the connections to what is well known to be a tax haven in the Cayman Islands would have raised questions that I think Labour wanted to avoid answering. For me, I think it's actually a bit more about what your main financial backers, being hedge funds and financial institutions, says about a political party. I think the tax stuff is interesting and it's worth looking into, but it's more for me and from our perspective at Open Democracy, it's more about seeing this as part of this trend where now basically the main stakeholder in the party of organised labour is the financial services sector.
It's unlikely. I mean, it strikes me as unlikely that your average trade unionist or traditional Labour voter, has a terrible amount in common with somebody who runs a hedge fund based in the Cayman Islands. I don't see that they have many overlapping.
No, and I think and it's worth spelling out that like politics is fundamentally about representing the interests of different groups. My personal view on this is that there is always going to be conflict in politics because you can't represent at the same time the interests of, say, the financial sector and, as it relates to the average person, the interests of the working person, because in lots of ways the financial sector benefits from certain policies being enacted which are not to the benefit of the working person. There is no, I mean, I think Labour are very keen to try out this line about being pro-business and pro-worker. And of course, there are some interests that overlap, investing in skills, for instance. It benefits both industry and individuals, workers, when the government puts money into further education colleges and things like that to make sure that people can get decent jobs and that there's a workforce that's there ready to take on decent jobs if we can provide them in the economy. But when we talk about deregulating further in the City of London, that does nothing for you or I or most of the people watching this, but it does an awful lot for people that run hedge funds that may or may not be registered in the Cayman Islands. So I think that's exactly what it is, isn't it? Most people who historically have associated themselves with the Labour Party, I think, are quite alarmed by this, and it goes further. I mean, I ran some figures before speaking to you today. I wanted to see how much money had come into Labour since 2022, which is broadly the date that I kind of take for the real change in Labour to start under Starmer. And since 2022, donations that have come directly from financial institutions or from individuals who are very closely aligned to that sector totals more than £13 million. Now, compare that to the three largest trade union affiliates to the party, who provide the biggest bulk from the trade union movement to the party, and who historically have always been the largest stakeholder group, to use a bit of corporate speak, backing the Labour Party. In that same period, they've only given just around 12 million, slightly less. Now, those numbers are fairly similar, right? But it's worth considering that the financial sector is just one corporate interest group. There are other wealthy individuals who are not in the financial sector that may have interests in all manner of different industries that are also chucking £1 million here, £3 million there at the party. So you now see the situation where the trade union influence is being massively watered down. And I think that's something that, most people who have historically backed the party are really uncomfortable with. And I think people can make their own minds about what that means for the party, but they should ultimately be given all the information that's available to make those decisions, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, we know that money talks, and I'm not saying this to suggest that Quadrature have had any say in this, but when you were talking about tax earlier on, it reminded me that Labour have pledged to keep corporation tax capped at its current level for the next 5 years for the length of this Parliament. So, I mean, money does talk, and this obviously all comes against the backdrop, if you like, of the freebies row, of the donations row over Keir Starmer apparently using Lord Ali's flat to record a COVID stay-at-home message where he wasn't apparently in his own home. But we were talking about this a bit earlier, Ethan, that you kind of see these things as slightly separate.
Yeah, I think they're worth separate. And I think it's easy when something like this becomes the story of the moment, donations and tickets and things like that. I think there's a tendency among some of our colleagues in the kind of the Westminster press to something isn't a story until it is, I think, is often the case. And I've been kind of highlighting a lot of these kind of what we might term to be smaller donations and amounts of money for things like football tickets for some time. But now the dam is broken, and there's a danger, I think, that it all gets pulled into one thing, and we start equating, someone who is ultimately in Lord Ali, a Labour peer, who, whatever one might say about him giving money to, at the time, shadow cabinet ministers or Keir Starmer, he's probably not quite right to think of him as someone who is totally separate from the party and trying to influence them. He is a Labour peer who probably he may have secondary objectives through his donations, but I think we can probably safely say does just want a Labour government. His version of Labour, I'm sure. And that may differ from what some people might like to see who have traditionally backed the party. But it's worth separating him from, lobbying firms seconding members of staff to people's offices at their own cost. That's a much clearer conflict of interest when they represent clients who stand to benefit from certain policies.
Or for instance, Premier League football teams that might want to influence a policy on the regulation of Premier League football teams.
Absolutely. I think it's worth keeping them separate. Ultimately, a £4 million donation as part of a £13 million flood of cash coming into the party over the couple of years tells us quite a lot about, in a practical sense, in a material sense, about what the Labour Party is right now and who it's set up to represent and who ultimately thinks that they stand to benefit from it doing well. A Labour lord giving, paying for dresses for Keir Starmer's wife, I think tells us an awful lot less about what this party is and what it's setting out to do. So I think that's my position on that. I think it's worth talking about when politicians get these things, and I think there's an element of hypocrisy when the party under Starmer has set its stall by standards at the expense of any real political or policy detail. It's all we really heard. They didn't really want to.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think, and I understand why people rightly feel somewhat kind of misled or cheated when integrity and public service has been the main pitch of this party, and you now see that they have been doing things that the vast majority of what's been reported is within the rules and has been declared, but the rules are not perfect, and just because something is declared doesn't mean it's not a potential conflict of interest. The point of declaring stuff is so that people like you or I, or even members of the public, can make up their own minds about whether it represents a conflict of interest. It doesn't negate the possibility that it is a conflict of interest, of course. But I think it's worth, just always putting these stories into a wider context and saying, what does it tell us about the Labour Party? Any one of these donations.
Definitely. I think that's all we've got time for, Ethan, but thanks again so much for taking the time to speak with us. It's really good to hear from you. And stay tuned, everyone, for more updates on whoever's got the most money to donate to Labour in the coming months. Sure that we'll find out.
Absolutely. Great. No, thanks for having me, and thanks for kind of continuing to kind of pick up on this kind of stuff.
Thank you very much, Ethan.